All right, it looks like we have a pretty good representation of the attendees that were registered. I appreciate you making time to join us today for this installment of Ask the Experts presented by Alchemy Technology Group. Today's expert will be Jason Samuel, and we'll dive into some introductions here in a second. But just some housekeeping from a webinar perspective. From a question submission and interactive polling, we really want to make this interactive with the audience, get your questions answered. The spirit behind these sessions is truly to have some real world dialogue and let's get some results. So from a control panel in the webinar series, you'll have a Q&A option there. Click on that button, you can type in your question, hit submit, we'll get it addressed in real time and as they come in. In addition to that, I'll also be initiating some polls throughout. They will pop up in your screen as long as you have the webinar as the focus. If not, a polls option will appear on the webinar control panel as well that you can select from to respond to the active polls. So let's go ahead and get right to the content. My name is Jarel Hall. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at Alchemy Technology Group. When I'm not hosting webinars, I serve as a digital therapist for most of our strategic customers and set the technology vision and direction here at Alchemy Technology Group. And joining me, as I mentioned, is Jason Samuel, who serves as a technical solutions manager for Alchemy. And Jason has a number of claim recognition in the marketplace, serving as a Citrix CTP, a VMware B expert, EUC champion, Microsoft Azure trusted advisor, you name it. Jason's been in the EUC space. So Jason, welcome. I appreciate you carving out time to support dialogue with our customers.
Yeah, thank you, Jarel.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So a part of the original registration form, users in the community were able to submit some questions. So I'll start off with those, and as they come in, we'll address the others. But out of the gate, work from home has really thrust EUC back into the limelight. It went from a Windows 10 back burner conversation to now being a true strategic conversation of how to enable a remote workforce. So one of the questions that came in was, what are some of the more predominant methods that you're seeing companies embrace a permanent work from home strategy, be it VPN, server-based computing, and VDI? Just give us your spin on that.
Yeah, so before a lot of companies relied on VPN being the older technology that's been around for years and years. And in the EUC space, we saw Citrix environments traditionally start being used internally to deliver server-based computing apps. And then over time, as VDI evolved, companies wanted to use VDI for increased mobility and for that single session type capability. And then we also saw companies opening it up for remote access. And so the Citrix environments are really intended for both internal and external environments, whereas VPN is intended only for external environments. Because VPN kind of predates server-based computing and EUC, we saw a lot of organizations just kind of hold on to VPN technologies for many years. Some organizations got rid of their VPNs and went to remoting protocols like Citrix HDX. They went to Microsoft RDP or even VMware with their Blast Extreme. There's different remoting protocols available. But some of the companies decided to choose those options because they're far more secure than VPN. VPN technology is really creating a tunnel between your endpoint, which is your house, and the data center, which has a lot of security implications. Additionally, there's a lot of traffic implications and so on that you have to prepare for. And how traffic is routed and some of the security behind that, such as web proxies, firewalls, and so on. So a lot of organizations moved off of that. With that said, when COVID hit, what we saw is a lot of organizations just kind of get overwhelmed. Their VPN environments were kind of advertised as the remoting mechanism, so they quickly had to scale up, without disturbing the user so much, their process so much. VPN was the easier approach, so they had to scale those appliances up. That became a challenge because you can't get appliances that quickly and racked and stacked in the data center. Additionally, some of the DMZ networks that VPN devices were on, they weren't really built for this amount of traffic. For example, one organization, they had recently changed out their core internal switching and routers, and they decided to move their slightly older hardware out into the DMZ because it still had some life. It wasn't end of life yet. And as COVID hit, what happened is that all their traffic really came in from the outside now, and the internal network, there was nobody in the offices, so all that brand new hardware wasn't really being utilized anymore. So it really flipped the data center on its head as far as traffic. So now you're having to worry about not only the VPN appliances, but actually the network within the data center, which in a software-defined data center, it's a lot easier to manage some of that traffic and convert certain switches over for a specific VLAN. But it's still a lot of work that you have to worry about. Additionally, the outbound network connectivity from the data center became a problem. A lot of organizations decided to do full tunnel. Full tunnel VPN means everything from your client network, meaning at your house. You go to Facebook, you go to YouTube, whatever, that all routes out through the data center and outbound to the internet, which means, somebody's watching a 4K video on YouTube or Netflix or whatever, as they're connected to the VPN, suddenly that traffic's coming from your data center. So now your outbound network circuits are also being very much overwhelmed. Companies that understood that, they decided to use split tunnel VPN. Split tunnel VPN is a much better approach where certain traffic is destined for the data center, whereas other internet traffic like YouTube and Facebook and so on go out directly on the home network. This is a better approach, especially in a cloud world where like a lot of services are coming from the cloud, and you can just say, hey, just use the home network for that. Don't route that through the data center. But then it also creates some problems with the content delivery networks. Every website that you visit these days has a huge backend infrastructure of content delivery networks where it's delivering static objects on the web page to the user. And sometimes these aren't coming from the same domain that you have whitelisted for it to go down a certain route. So now with split tunnel, some organizations saw where some of the traffic was going through the data center for a particular site, and then some components of that website were going through the home network. So now it was creating some oddities in how pages were loading, some performance issues. O365, for example, is a major one for performance issues because it's designed to hit the nearest POP to your house, the point of presence in their what they call Office 365 front doors. And now, even though the user is sitting at home and they have a POP nearby that's optimal for them, because they're going through the data center, they're now hitting a POP that's closest to the data center. So now the traffic for everything O365, Teams, video, chatting, all that stuff is going through an unoptimized or not the most optimal path, let's say.
Yep,
that
absolutely.
creates video stuttering and all sorts of problems.
Absolutely, and that's exactly, you're spot on. We saw some challenges with VPN early on, and if you look at the poll, it looks like 93% responded to some VDI elements. We still have about 80% using VPN, 60% using published apps, and then SaaS is starting to creep in there at the bottom. So about what I would have expected. And we look at some of the, just to bring it to the forefront, some of the other questions. Windows Virtual Desktop, when we talk about VDI and some of the evolution there, one of the other questions centered on WVD. We've seen this topic pop up in a number of our organizations that we partner with. The question really was, materially from a production perspective, how ready and primed is WVD in the marketplace?
Oh, that's a great question. So, I have to take it back a little bit just to make sure everybody understands what WVD is. When we traditionally did server-based computing, we used things like XenApp. I know there's a large Citrix audience on the phone today, on the call today. And with Citrix environments, we used, Server 2008 R2, Server 2012, Server 2016, Server 2019, or whatever it is in your environment, to have that multi-session capability where we can load on as many users as we want for density purposes, and we can deliver applications or the entire published desktop. We also had, with Citrix and VMware, we had the capability of using Windows 10 single session, which is taking a Windows 10 Enterprise image and then having that single session capability to a multitude of our users. So we had apps or published desktops from servers, and then we had the full-blown desktop with it's carved out just for that user with Windows 10. What we were doing over the years with that server-based computing is we were using RDS, essentially, right? We were using that RDS Cal at least to be able to have that capability to share a server OS with many end users. Over time, we saw that putting users on servers is not really the approach that Microsoft really wanted. They felt that having to manage that user experience at the server level and try and mimic Windows 10 experience is not like the best approach. So they decided to offer a service that offers Windows 10 single session, as well as release a new operating system called Windows 10 multi-session. So multi-session is the new, Windows 10 multi-session is the kind of the modern session host for high density computing, where you can pack on as many users as you want onto one host. So things like Server 2019, Server 2016, those are now considered legacy hosts. So the key part, though, is that Windows 10 multi-session is only allowed to be run in Azure. You cannot run it on-prem unless you use Azure Stack Hub, which is in a preview as of December, but that's the only way you can run it on-prem. And Azure Stack Hub, for those of you that don't know it, it's a type of hyperconverged infrastructure. It's a half rack. Different brands make it. I've seen one that was an HP half rack with an Azure logo on the front. It's meant for disconnected scenarios. So if you have an organization that is very large and has computing needs in the middle of nowhere, where the network is very, very shoddy, there's some areas of the world where you don't get the type of bandwidth that your data centers, that your primary data centers have. So in this case, you have the ability to run Azure locally. Essentially, take a part of the cloud and run it locally, and you're still paying Microsoft for that compute. So not only are you paying for the hardware, but you have to pay for the compute on there as well. So you can run Windows 10 multi-session there. Over time, we may be able to see the licensing evolve to where you can run things on-prem, but right now, as it stands, Windows 10 multi-session is only able to be run in Azure. Now, the actual control plane for WVD is also in Azure. And this is really the evolution of RDS. And in fact, WVD was initially called RDMI, Remote Desktop Modern Infrastructure. For 2 years, while it was being in development, that's what we were playing with the RDMI bits. And then last year is when they went generally available with it, right around Q4, just right before Q4 actually. And it was called WVD at that point. So now, you're not celebrating the infrastructure portion, calling it remote desktop modern infrastructure, but instead we're celebrating the fact that it's a functional system delivering Windows desktops, as well as apps, because it can also deliver remote apps as well if you just want to deliver specific applications. But really, we're celebrating the fact that you can deploy the entire desktop to a user.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know some of the challenges with WVD and to your point, RDMI, when it first came out, was exactly that, the control plane, the management of the devices. And we saw it partner with some other things such as VMware and Citrix. One of the other questions was really around production readiness. We're still seeing a lot of better together stories for WVD, namely in the virtual apps and desktop space for the cloud service. Is that still the recommended approach for a production deployment of WVD?
So it depends on the organization. Recently, WVD came out with their spring update just last month, actually. And what it is now it has a GUI. Whereas before, WVD didn't really have a GUI. You were doing everything with PowerShell. You were kind of building it yourself by hand. But now it's fully integrated into ARM, which is what drives everything in Azure. And so it's part of the the left-hand navigation. It's actual blade in there, and you can deploy and manage WVD very easily. With that said, WVD is still a very young platform that's being developed. It is being actively developed by a very large team with an amazing roadmap that they're working on, and that's public if you ever look it up. But with that said, there are still going to be some gaps within the product where they depend on the partner ecosystem to fill that in. So that's where CVAT service can be used to extend WVD. You can also use VMware Horizon Cloud. I mean, there's different ways to be able to extend it. And one of the things that we see a lot is actually companies using CVAT service to extend WVD. The main thing is that the key takeaway really is that you don't use the control plane in WVD. You don't have to use ARM or anything to manage it. Instead, you use the CVAT service, the Citrix Studio that you're used to. So what the benefit there is, a lot of companies that are already Citrix customers, they can continue deploying stuff on-prem, they can deploy stuff in Azure, and they can take advantage of the Windows 10 multi-session OS in Azure. So all of it in one single pane of glass. You don't have to change any of your training, all your admins and architects. I mean, it's the same thing that we've been doing for years. You don't have to change anything. And additionally, remote PC, you also can access physical machines through CVAT service. So that really became a big thing we saw, especially with COVID. You know, how do we get access to physical machines? Well, you can do it all through Workspace, just one single pane of glass for administration and one pane of glass for users to be able to choose apps, physical desktops, and virtual desktops.
Absolutely. And you touched on something. I'll move this question up that came in around the CVAT service and the evolution of that. You know, the messaging to the marketplace a few years ago was to start with the control plane and then eventually move, you know, your VDAs and your resource locations to different cloud providers. Is that materializing in the marketplace today? Are we actually seeing move beyond the control plane?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I started first working with Citrix Cloud and CVAT service in 2017. And at the time, I was a big naysayer myself. I didn't think this was going to really take off. I'm used to building delivery controllers, managing my own SQL, having storefront and NetScalers, ADCs on-prem. And that's all I knew how to do back then. So then I started kicking the tires on CVAT service, and you know, I started seeing the value of it because they started putting features in there way before they would put it in the on-prem components. Additionally, a lot of that management headache that I had to deal with started going away. Over time, I saw a lot of organizations begin to adopt CVAT service. So they would migrate off of their on-prem control planes, meaning they would decom storefront, they would decom NetScalers, they would decom delivery controllers, they would decom director and SQL, and instead use CVAT service for that control plane, which is always up to date, always there. It's just a website, really. It's just a web service that's available to you. And then from there, they concentrated on managing other things, more important things like the workloads, the user experience, the security behind it, all these other components that usually fall to the wayside because we don't have time to deal with it. Now we have the time. We have the ability to work on improving those pieces. So I've seen a lot of success, actually, a lot of success stories. I'm actively working with a lot of companies that have CVAT service there and have kind of got to that dream level that you just mentioned, Jarel, where the workloads are on-prem, the workloads are in Azure, the workloads are in AWS, the workloads are in GCP, wherever they need to be, and it's all managed by that one control plane.
Absolutely. Yeah, get used to the term hybrid multi-cloud, right? So question from the audience that came in, and we saw this a lot during the earlier work from home pushes and initiatives. Question centers around authentication. So how easy is it to start transitioning to the new passwordless authentication vision now that users are using, you know, VDI and mobile devices rather than their internal desktops?
Yeah, so with passwordless authentication, it's really a conversation around strong authentication. That's another way to put it. These days, when you go to Best Buy, you buy a laptop, you'll notice it has a fingerprint reader in it. Some of them have an infrared camera in it. Some still have regular webcams, but there are actual laptops out there where if you look closely, it's got like a little infrared camera. And that's for being able to map the face, just kind of like our phones. Like mobile phones have the ability to do Face ID and so on. Just like that, your laptop can do that as well. So what Microsoft has done is they have Windows Hello for Business, which is basically taking advantage of those biometric-based authentication devices, which is, again, an infrared camera or a fingerprint reader on your laptop to authenticate with the local Windows 10 machine. This has been kind of the primary way of getting passwordless authentication to the hands of users very quickly. And this is one that I've seen a lot of success with. There's a lot of things that you have to have in your environment, namely Azure AD, for example. There's trust versus certificate-based decisions that you have to make there. But all in all, it works really well. Users don't have to worry about using their passwords. Now, when it comes to remoting protocols, when we're talking about web, essentially, where we're hitting a gateway service and we need to authenticate there, Azure AD has the capability to do Microsoft Authenticator passwordless phone sign-in, which is using the Authenticator app with primary passwordless authentication instead of using it as secondary, where you still have to put in your password and then use Authenticator as a second factor. Instead, that's flipped. You no longer have to put in the password. The Authenticator becomes the primary authenticator. And then the third way that Microsoft allows passwordless authentication is using FIDO2 security keys, which is a piece of hardware, actually. There's several types of keys available, and you can buy them from pretty much anywhere. A lot of different manufacturers make them. And what you do is you just plug it into either your Windows 10 device or whatever device you have. It's a USB, it can be a Bluetooth, it can be NFC, and you use that. There's usually a biometric reader on there, so you use your fingerprint to unlock it, or you use a PIN if you want to use a PIN number. But you basically unlock the key. You don't actually send your biometrics over the network or anything like that. It's just like your phone. You unlock it locally, and then there's a trust between that, that piece of plastic and circuit board and Azure AD, and that's what unlocks it. So there's three main passwordless mechanisms available. The third one, the FIDO2 one especially, I really love because that's an open standard. It's not just a Microsoft thing. So you can use it with other identity providers like Okta, Ping, and so on. Everybody's kind of embracing this. Now, with those three, I just said, the two that you can use with remoting protocols right now are going to be Authenticator phone sign-in and FIDO2. So, for example, CVAT service, you hit your workspace, it's going to redirect you to Azure AD immediately, and then you authenticate using one of those mechanisms. Same thing, if you choose to use WVD, you hit their gateway URL, and you can use those same mechanisms.
Okay, perfect. And just checking on our poll, looks like we're at 50%, 56% are either currently using passwordless authentication or have it on an existing roadmap. So you definitely are starting to see the tide turn. And to your point around the offline aspects, you're starting to see some control systems and some restricted areas adopted with the FIDO2 keys as opposed to the Authenticator apps and what have you.
Yeah, traditionally, like things like this is a HID prox card. We've used these to get into places, and some of them have a little chip on it, which makes it a smart card, and you use that to authenticate. And this is legacy now. Instead, we're using these. Look at this form factor on a FIDO2 key, and you use this for those type of control systems. And also, you can use these for step-up authentication. So not only can you get in as an end user, but if you need to get into a high security application or so on, you can prompt the user to log in with one of these as another form of high identity assurance.
Yeah, absolutely. And another question that actually came in on one of the registration links around that, conditional access. So talking about step-up authentication, conditional access, is that obviously something we're recommending for our customers, market availability and just, production cutovers. How functional do you see that, and are we actually seeing that in production environments today?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So conditional access goes hand in hand with authentication. So everything I've covered so far has been authentication, how to get people in the front door. After that comes authorization. That's the other big piece of perimeter security, identity-based security, or essentially identity and access management. So in Azure AD, you allow these passwordless mechanisms in, and then you also have to put conditional access policies in place to protect the applications. So what it means essentially is if this, then that. What it looks at is, where's the user coming from? How is the user authenticated? Did they use strong authentication or do they use legacy authentication? What IP address are they using? What security group are they in? If it matches any of these criteria, then do this. And the do this can be anywhere from block access outright to saying, hey, you have access, but only for this amount of time, and then your token's going to be expired and you're going to get kicked out. You can set all sorts of things up, but it's basically if this, then do that. And that's what conditional access is. So what I see is any company that embraces Azure AD and starts using passwordless authentication, they're going to use conditional access as well. That's the other component. They go hand in hand, and you have to have both to really be able to lock down your cloud applications, your SaaS application, whatever it is that you're trying to protect with Azure AD.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, Azure AD, we're seeing that take, foothold as far as a requirement for a lot of these newer platforms, to spend a moment on that Azure AD versus on-prem domain services versus the Azure Active Directory domain services. That's a mouthful for Microsoft. You know, kind of speak to Azure and AD and how it's playing a role in organizations today, and if you're seeing traditional domain services subside.
Yeah, I am seeing that. There's always going to be domain controllers and traditional Active Directory, at least for the next few years, especially as the larger your organization is, the more time you may need. But what I'm seeing is that Azure AD is taking precedence. I've seen organizations where they don't even want to create security groups in local Active Directories anymore because it's gotten too immense, and it's just easier to create things in Azure AD and not have to worry about it. All the identity improvements that Microsoft is doing these days are in their cloud-based identity platform, which is Azure AD. You're not going to see a whole lot of benefits coming in on-prem anything these days. So you kind of have to move to Azure AD if you want to run a modern Windows computing environment. Even your devices, like your laptops, those have to be either hybrid Azure AD joined or AD joined these days to be able to take advantage of some of the features. For example, the Fido 2 keys I just held up a minute ago and I was discussing. Yeah, sure, you can use it with SaaS applications today, you know, open it up in a browser and use it, but you can also use that Fido 2 key at the Windows 10 login page on your, or login screen on your laptop itself. That's in preview right now, actually. So one of the requirements is that that device has to be hybrid Azure AD joined to be able to take advantage of that feature. So we're already seeing this where Microsoft is requiring all devices to be Azure AD aware. In fact, if you look at the registry on Windows 10 these days, if you look at the credential providers, there's like something like 23 credential providers in there now, and like more than half of them are Azure AD aware. So that's telling you something right there, that we are seeing a giant shift to cloud identity.
Awesome. Question that came in, and actually it's funny, we have a video on this one that addresses it. But are there easy ways to authenticate third parties in the CVAD without them knowing their internal credentials to the environment, basically getting SSO'd into the environment without pre-existing knowledge of the creds?
Yes, so with CVAD, absolutely, you can do that. You have to leverage Citrix FAS, which is Federated Authentication Service. What it is basically a middleman that takes modern authentication, web-based authentication, and then converts it into something that the Windows 10 OS can understand. Right now, Windows 10 over remoting protocol can only understand password, or it can understand smart card. And what FAS does is it mimics a virtual smart card. Really, it's just taking a certificate from your local CA and then passing that to Windows 10 and completing that SSO very seamlessly for the user. So it feels like, you know, the user just clicks on the app or desktop, it launches, FAS kicks in, users don't even realize it, and, you know, suddenly they're at their Windows 10 desktop. With third parties, you can absolutely go passwordless for them. This is something that I see all the time because these are third parties that you don't control. They might share passwords. You know, it might be like a marketing team somewhere, a third-party vendor that's doing marketing for your organization, and you might give a few people credentials, but the reality is there's a huge team supporting them. So people start sharing credentials and things, and there's no identity assurance. There's no way of telling who's doing what. So where we see for third parties, what we can do is just using one of the passwordless authentication mechanisms where we're using their phone and requiring them to on their iPhone or Android, download Authenticator and roll a passwordless phone sign-in upon their first login, or you ship them out a bunch of Fido 2 keys or order them from Amazon or wherever, and you tell them, go ahead and plug that in and roll, and it's your key. You do whatever you want with it. You can use it for your own personal sites if you want, but for our authentication purposes, you are locked down to only using that. And so you have to put your fingerprint on there and unlock it with your biometric so that we know it's you, and plus you don't have any password. So you log in to Workspace that way, you launch your virtual desktop, the user's in Windows 10 virtual desktop, and they never know their password.
Absolutely. And another thing that we've seen, and we actually have an illustration, if you go to the Alchemy website, there's a cartoon that kind of explains it out, is the true modern to modern or SAML to SAML federation, in which the third party is actually using their credentials to provision and provide access into another environment's Citrix application. So we have done that for a few customers, and if you check out the Alchemy website, we've got a cartoon and an illustration of what that architecture looks like. Typically, for more permanent solutions, think of a primary care solution in which neighboring hospitals share physicians and they want to use the company A credentials for company B access. So something we do see a lot, especially with the M&A likely ahead of us with some of the market conditions we're seeing out there. So a couple different ways to pull that off. Sticking with the Azure and the authentication conversations, we talk about some of the how do we get into production, and one of the things our PMO often will call out is the change management. So back to the ease of transition, some of those pain points, what are some of the blind spots when you are making that shift to passwordless authentication?
Okay, that's actually a great point. So passwordless authentication from a technical standpoint is extremely easy. And for end users, it's a wonderful experience. Like they embrace it immediately. The problem is getting there. How do we get there? And because when you say passwordless, you're taking something away. When you tell other people that don't work in identity and access management, that word, you're taking something away, it scares them because people like to have things, not get stuff taken away from them. So to really get passwordless authentication momentum in your organization, it starts at the top level. You can always convince engineers, architects, and so on of the strategy because it's a clear path. We're down in the trenches and we see what's going on and where Microsoft is taking things. So it's very easy for us to go down that path. But you won't be successful unless you have that leadership level kind of getting them on board with the strategy. Exactly.
Yep.
So you have to get them to understand that this is the way to go. It's not the way of the future, it's the way of the now. There's a lot of advantages to doing this. Half the service desk tickets are related to password resets, and the other thing is like users getting phished or their passwords just floating out there on Pastebin or wherever they're getting dropped these days. Eliminating that whole portion of password management, just throw that out the door and just go fully passwordless and not have to worry about all this stuff. That's very compelling for that, that C-level executive. So your CISO probably already has some of this stuff floating in their head. They just don't know how to do it. So the best thing for an engineer architect to do, or even a manager or director, VP, whoever is in the audience today, is to figure out who in your organization is really interested in this, who sees the value, and then align with that. Because you need to get that top-down alignment. And then once you have that from an IT organization perspective, then you know how to roll it out. The technical stuff is not a challenge at all. It's actually really, really easy. And then getting users to be able to use it, there's actually marketing and branding material out there already from Microsoft. You can just take that, put your logo on there, and throw it out to your users. And you can enforce them to have to onboard in one of these passwordless methods upon their next authentication. So it's just very easy to onboard users.
Absolutely. So change management, communication, the typical things we see drive IT project success stories, right? So looking at that, another question that came in around kind of the virtualization space. We look at all the different protocols. You touched on it earlier, Blast Extreme and HDX, and then obviously what's coming around with Microsoft and RDP. When we look at that ecosystem of remoting technologies, customers are still navigating that space with a lot of historical information. What's kind of the recommendation from your perspective on those technologies? Is still one that's favored over another? Is it kind of a choose your own adventure? What's that space look like at large at this point?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, Jarel. So a long time ago, there used to be what's called protocol wars. That's been in the EUC space. All the community folks talking about protocols and trying to figure out which one is better. And then we had different folks come up with their own little recipes for tweaking these protocols and trying to make it better. And over time, it's gotten to the point now where these protocols are pretty much very equal in what some of their capabilities. So don't get too hung up on protocols. They're all quite good. In fact, it used to be that one protocol used to be good for text and another protocol used to be good for video. So if you were doing things like CAD or SolidWorks or like in healthcare, for example, you would have like radiology, X-rays and stuff like that. Yeah, versus the typical enterprise user, like an oil and gas and financial, where we would just be in Outlook all day or be browsing the web or whatever it is. You know, there you could choose a protocol or choose how to tweak things. And now what we're seeing is, like, for example, HDX, you have the ability to for it to be very adaptive, where it looks at the network bandwidth of the user and it adjusts the protocol accordingly. It also looks at things on the page, like, hey, this part is a video and this part is text, so I'm going to optimize for both. Like, this section is going to be optimized this way and this part is going to be optimized a different way. So you're seeing that level of optimization on the fly from these protocols. So, you know, really don't get too hung up on the protocols. I would say they're pretty much very close in capability to one another. There are other more important considerations than just protocols when you're delivering a EUC environment.
Absolutely. Just to remind all the attendees, you can use your Q&A option on the toolbar to submit any questions for Jason or myself, and we'll get to them with haste. So, you know, looking at kind of the go forward strategy, we have a lot of organizations getting back to business, and you end up with this hybrid model. So you have some people in the office using your traditional work styles, and now you have a remote community. And one of the areas that's in question here is performance management, right? Because now this is a permanent situation. So guidance there, question being, you know, what are some of the considerations and or platforms out there to truly manage the performance for this hybrid environment around, you know, user experience, you name it?
Yep. So yeah, I mean, this is kind of the normal these days. In fact, we had somebody on another webinar last week, actually, that was talking about their environment, how they had to scale up their VDI environment, how they had to leverage multi-cloud, 2 different clouds, Azure and GCP, for example, in order to service, you know, tens of thousands of users. And now the company's leadership has decided this is actually very productive. This actually went really well. We transformed our business in the matter of weeks, and we're going to stay like this. So now you've gotten to that point where users are very happy and very productive, and you've got IT that has basically discarded all the legacy stuff and is really running things very modern. So now we start tweaking it. We start looking at, okay, what did we miss? And performance is one of those things that comes into play. Performance and security, actually. But one of the things that we're seeing is that a lot of unmanaged devices are now accessing corporate information, corporate data. Like I said, VPN is still very popular, and some folks have had to install VPN clients on their kid's laptop because that's all they had at the time.
Sure.
These organizations weren't issuing $3,000 laptops to every one of their users. You know, they depended on physical machines in the office, and now those physical machines are still in the office and the users out here. So, you know, how do we get endpoints into the user's hands, and then how do we secure those endpoints? So, you know, we've seen all sorts of strategies. We've seen, for example, thin clients like iGels being sent out into the field for these users, just being mailed to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one way. You know, it's a hardened Linux system that accesses virtual desktops or virtual apps. That's a very good way to solve that challenge. But for those with laptops and prefer that whole laptop experience, or even a computer, a PC they had at home, that's now an unmanaged device. How do we securely allow them to continue what they're doing? And so we start looking at things like, obviously, virtual desktops and virtual apps, where there's no tunnel established and it's very secure, and we use different types of security policies to lock down USB drives and screenshotting and keyloggers and stuff from interacting with the corporate environment. But then we also look at the posture of the device itself, and we could use things like a CASB, like a Cloud Access Security Broker. One popular one in Azure, for example, is MCAS, Microsoft Cloud App Security. That's one that I've been working with as of late, and just to be able to protect Office 365 itself. You know, MCAS is really excellent at that. There's other services from like Palo Alto, from Cato, and so on, that deliver actually a step above CASB. CASB is just one component. Cloud Access Security Broker is about protecting the cloud platform, you know, whatever the SaaS application is. But then going into down the network layer, like how do we make sure that network is secure, that they're coming from? And then how do we look at that endpoint and say, hey, that particular piece of traffic that's hitting us, how do we make sure that's secure? And so it's now becoming a more all-encompassing term, which is basically secure access service edge.
No sassy.
SASE, yeah, exactly. So it's interesting to see how that is coming to play now. I mean, again, that's one of those gaps that people didn't really prepare for, and is now becoming very prevalent in large enterprises.
Absolutely. And the one that we want to address today, we've actually had it pop up a couple of times, is how do we ensure improved productivity now that we have a remote workforce and we don't have eyes on glass capabilities and understanding where an employee's at. There's some unique things. We'll probably do a webinar about that at some future date around insider threat tools that are being used, but productivity measurement is going to be another topic that probably hits the mainstream marketplace in the next couple of weeks now that you truly are adopting a permanency to working remotely. So again, Q&A toolbar is there for you if you have any additional questions. Transitioning and still kind of placating to both the security, performance, and virtualization spaces. Cloud is a subject that we've bounced around internally as a construct, and there's so many different ways that you can run with that. So the hybrid multi-cloud comment I made earlier was sourced out of a question. From a hybrid multi-cloud, we are starting to see outages here and there, and it's going to happen. You architect for failure, right? So from a true multi-cloud perspective, where are we at with that in true production environments, and how are we seeing that play out in the marketplace?
Yep, and from a virtual apps and virtual desktop, that's essentially IaaS, right? Infrastructure as a service. So using a different cloud to deliver 100 virtual desktops from here and 100 virtual desktops from there, it's very easy to do, especially with something like CVAT service, where it's one control plane and you're just hooking into these different clouds and deploying the same master image to these different clouds. Where we're seeing things be, hey, we have to use one cloud only, is when it comes to platform as a service, PaaS offerings. So Azure AD, for example, is a platform. You can't use Azure AD in GCP. Now, can you authenticate on Workspace with Azure AD and then deliver a GCP IaaS workload? Absolutely. But if Azure AD were to have, God forbid, an outage or something, then yeah, you're highly dependent on that one particular cloud. So really, it becomes an exercise in understanding what you're using for PaaS and what cloud, and what's the high availability, what's the redundancy, what's the plan for, God forbid, an outage or whatnot. And then separating that out from the IaaS, the workload portion, and understanding, hey, yeah, we can run this multi-cloud. And it's like, as you said, hybrid multi-cloud, where some of it could even be from on-prem, right?
Yep.
And then you're spreading your workloads out very sensibly and cost effectively, but also taking in or accounting for the need for that high availability, where if one cloud or one network path or something were having an issue, how can you still continue delivering services with minimal disruption to your users?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. Those cloud assessments, because cost and security and compliance are some of the things that we often see as an overshot type of situation where you're planning for that hybrid multi-cloud. So, good commentary there. You touched on this earlier in a question come in around the thin client space. So the remote work, whether it's permanent, whether it's temporary, that space has gotten, pretty saturated, and then you bubbled out some top competitors. Touch on that space and what it looks like. I know we lean on a couple of strategic partners in the thin client area. What does that space look like right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's different thin client vendors out there, and I mean, obviously pick whatever fits best for your organization. One that I really like is iGel. I've been using their thin clients for a very long time. They're not just about thin clients; they're really about their OS, and it's a very compelling message once you start diving into it a little bit, and just the management of it, because you don't want to just distribute thin clients and then get them stuck on some legacy OS, and then it's going to have problems and you can't upgrade. For example, like the Firefox version in it, or whatever that is being used to access things, or just the client, like the Citrix client that's embedded in the OS. You want to be able to manage these without the need for the corporate network to really touch it. And that's where iGel is really nice, where you can have these out in the field with no VPN tunnel back, and you can still manage the devices and kind of be able to to just ease of administration, really.
Yeah. I
So
remember when they introduced the ICG, the cloud gateway for administration outside of your DMZ. That was a huge boon for them from back to your management concept, and it's helped a lot of our customers with a lot of field deployments.
yep, exactly.
Absolutely. So I'll pause here to see if we have any Q&A questions submitted via chat. Let you take a sip of water as well. I know this can get a little parched talking this much. I don't see any new questions. I'll pause for a second. I'll give the audience another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll wrap up with some closing thoughts here. And scene. So, Jason, we've covered a lot of ground here. We have a lot of different things happening in the marketplace right now to get not only the audience and other customers back on track and back to business, but we were in the middle of a lot of the digital transformation ahead of what just transpired in the spring. Any closing thoughts for the audience as far as what they can take back to their environments, their stakeholders, their board? Give you the floor.
Yeah, sure. So, digital transformation used to be a buzzword. Nobody really knew what it was. And every day we'd come into work and we'd just try and advance the environment forward just inch by inch. And that's how we've done things for years. And then Gartner and Forrester and all of them decided to put a buzzword on it. But suddenly we started with COVID just hitting us out of the blue like this. We really now understand what digital transformation is. It's not a buzzword. It's being able to be agile and not, well, I mean, being able to react, but also being somewhat proactive is just very important now. COVID was really about, for a lot of organizations, being reactive, but those that were already proactive, that were going down the path of using the cloud, using cloud identity providers, using IaaS, using PaaS, these companies were more forward thinking. And because they were that proactive and were already on that digital transformation path, they didn't have as many challenges. They really just scaled up what they were already doing or were already building in their environment. So they had a very good time transitioning their workforce over to an external workforce. Companies that weren't as proactive and going down these paths suddenly got thrust into this. Now they have to figure out how to get out of their data centers or how to deliver stuff from their data centers or even the cloud in a better optimized fashion. And they're starting from scratch, essentially. So the key takeaway is, think of your digital transformation as something that is not just a buzzword. I mean, we now practice it daily. We had to in just a matter of months. So be very strategic about it and just understand the long-term path, especially now that this is how business is going to be for the next few years for many organizations, is continue advancing. Don't stop. Don't come into work and try and go for that incremental inch at a time. Plan for the long term. Yeah, you have to increment, daily, weekly, and so on, but plan for the long term and continue down this path. Don't stop is the message.
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, our goal as a true value-added partner is we want to equip you with information. So in addition to this series, we'll have a host of these Ask the Experts with our consulting organization participating and guiding the conversation. But I also want to direct you to our website where we've got a number of blogs and free information and insights around work from home best practices, common challenges, and just overall EUC, data center transformation, hybrid multi-cloud, security, identity and access. All of our practices are covered. So favorite our website. There's always some knowledge being shared out there. We're all about the community. We're all about sharing information, enabling our customers and our partners. We appreciate you guys making time today. I think, Jason, I appreciate you making time to share the information with the audience, attendees. I know time is precious. Appreciate you carving out some time to spend with Alchemy today. Again, if you have any questions on the content today or any other follow-up dialogue, reach out to your representative from Alchemy or visit our website, or you can email info@alchemytechgroup.com. I appreciate you again. Have a great day.